Chloe. I am the Outreach and Events Manager at Indigo Bridge Bookstore. We're very excited to have authors Mei Chai and Belinda Tong with us today to discuss their short story collection and debut novel, respectively, among other things. I'll start off by introducing both of them, and then I will turn it over to them. Mei Chai is an award-winning author of 11 books, 3 novels, 2 works of memoir, a highly lauded collection of short stories, a nonfiction book about the history of China, and a translation of a Chinese text into English. Her 2018 short story collection, Useful Phrases for Immigrants, won the American Book Award, and Chai is a recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, the 2014 APALA Literature Award, the 2008 Kiriyama Prize for Notable Book, and a nomination for the National Book Award in Nonfiction. Her essay, The Blue Boot, edited by Cheryl Strayed, was named a notable essay of 2012 in Best American Essays 2013. Her work has appeared in a number of publications, including Entropy, the Los Angeles Times, and the Paris Review Online, and numerous anthologies, including Best Small Fictions. Her latest publication, Tomorrow in Shanghai, deftly explores cultural complexities in China and the Chinese diaspora in America through a series of short stories that take the reader to rural China, Middle America, France, and even a future Chinese colony on Mars. Chai's stories explore racism, sexism, sexuality, and class in nuanced, compassionate, and gripping prose. Belinda Tong is a 2021 graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she was a Truman Capote Fellow and recipient of the Missioner Copernicus Fellowship. Her debut novel, A Map for the Missing, follows the story of a Chinese-born American assistant professor who returns to his home village after receiving news that his father is missing. Tong beautifully unpacks her character's attempt to make sense, I'll admit somebody really quickly, to make sense of his identity and past, traveling through the 1970s and 1990s and tackling the meaning of family and home against the historical backdrop of post-cultural revolution China. So thank you both again for being with us tonight, and I will turn it over to you two now.
Great. Thank you so much, Chloe. Thank you so much for hosting this event. And I'm just so thrilled to be in conversation with Belinda. I loved A Map for the Missing so much. And because we have this coincidental but really interesting family background in Anhui. So I know before you ask me your questions, I have to ask, what is your family from Anhui? What was the
Yeah, I was so surprised when you reached out to me and said that. My dad is from out, both of my parents are from Anhui, and my dad particularly, his entire family history is all in Anhui, in a city called Chaohu, which was recently dissolved actually and absorbed into Hefei city. But they are from a village that's near there. Yeah. What about you?
Well, this is why I wanted to review your book. And when I actually asked to review it. And it's wonderful because of the plot. It's about, the two brothers, an older brother and a younger brother in the Cultural Revolution. And it kind of drives their family apart because the younger one wants to go to university and the older brother kind of helps to smuggle him out to take the Gaokao exam. Well, that is my grandfather's story. But a generation earlier. My grandfather is from Anhui province, and he was born, when it was still Imperial China. We don't know the exact date because he would never tell us. He would never tell anyone in the family, and he changed his documents when he came to the United States to make himself younger so he could work longer. So because of that kind of immigrant secret, he would never reveal his true birth year. But when he was a boy, he was very, very, very smart, but his father had 2 sons and wanted him as the second son to stay home in the village and run the family's soy sauce shop. And his older brother knew that he was so brilliant that this was not fair to him. So he smuggled him out under false pretenses to Shanghai, where he took the university exam and he scored so highly he was able to go to Tsinghua in Beijing. And then he went on a Boxer Indemnity Fund scholarship to, of all places, Stanford. So
Wow.
so when I read your novel, I was like, oh my gosh, there's
Yeah.
someone else on this earth. And and it just caused such a conflict when the family and the brothers were there's long history of repercussions of this. And because it's against the patriarchy, the father is supposed to make these decisions, and brothers banding together to go against the father's will is, until I read your story, I thought unheard of except in my family. So
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah, that's so fascinating because one of the comments that I would get when from readers about the book was like, oh, it seems unrealistic. Like, would the dad really actually be so against the son going and getting an education? Because like that's so contrary to what we
That's a
expect our
stereotype.
parents want us to do. And I was like, yeah, this really did happen back then, that it was viewed as like so dangerous and so different to go into a city.
And yeah, and to go against the father's will, and then my grandfather was the second son, and so there's all of that. And I wrote about that in a memoir called The Girl from Purple Mountain, and it's mostly about my grandmother, but I have put some of that backstory in there. So I was thrilled to read A Map for the Missing and to see, like, well, I mean, it's sad, it's tragic in some ways, that this kind of family, dilemma exists, but it was also affirming, right? To see that, wow, this type of dilemma is also part of someone else's family. But
Mhm.
also An Hui, I'm like, oh my gosh, what if it
Yeah.
goes to An Hui men with this kind of family story, but just generations apart?
Yes, yes. Yeah. And it is like Anhui is one of those regions where you meet fewer people in terms of Chinese American immigrants to the US that are from that area. So it is totally crazy. Um, I also had a similar experience of reading this book and feeling like there were so many experiences in it that I thought were so specific to me that I was shocked to see in fiction. And a big part of those were particularly the nuances and being in a study abroad community in China. Um, I spent 2 years studying in Beijing in recent history from 2016 to 2018, being a part of like an international community of students, which I found to be a very interesting and oftentimes dramatic experience, as you depict in these stories so well. And I was wondering if you could also talk a little bit about your experience studying abroad and your experience in China. What motivated you to go there and what was it like when you were there?
It's so interesting when you told me that, because I thought, oh wow, things have not changed then. I
Yeah.
kind of thought maybe it's gotten better, but maybe not. Yeah, there's a lot of tensions with, I feel like all the kinds of different international students. And certainly when I was there, I went to China for the first time with my father for a family reunion in 1985 when I was a teenager. That was my father's first time back since 1945, 49, when the family had
Wow.
fled because of the Communist Revolution. And so it was very, very, very emotionally charged for him. Like he met relatives who'd been, frankly, from this Cultural Revolution era, who had been tortured and beaten and sent down, and because they had all been educated, right? And in that era, educated people were seen with suspicion, and also they'd been Western educated, and they had been doctors, and they had stayed in China because they were very patriotic. They thought, we're not political, we're doctors, who cares? But nothing was not political during the
Mhm.
Cultural Revolution. So it was very traumatic for my father, but really very interesting for me. And so I continued to go back with him. But then when I had the opportunity to go on a study abroad program with my college, I decided, yeah, I'm going to go. And so I went in a series, like I went for 2 years, but in different kind of capacities. So the first time I went as an international student, and I went to Nanjing, which was my grandmother's hometown. Um, and then I studied at Nanda. And then I went back the following year on a fellowship through my college. We had a teaching fellowship at a local middle school where we could also study at Nanjing University. And so they were kind of back to back, but I was there from 88 with a short break in 89 to graduate, and then went back again in the year of martial law after the Tiananmen crackdown from 89 to 90. So it was really a very interesting time period to be there, as you can imagine. Just one, because so many dramatic events. 88 was it's very open in some ways, but there were still a lot of student protests. And then that culminated into the big student protests that got cracked down. And then martial law was imposed. And there were not that many international students because many people pulled out. Um, and so we were kind of a rarity, but there were still international students. I don't think people realize, like, just in general, how global China is. even in the 80s, and certainly today, I don't know, maybe perhaps less so because it's like lockdown right now because of COVID, but just, and so it's an interesting mix of people and privileges and personalities. And I was going because this was my grandmother's hometown, and I felt like affinity as a Chinese American, and I kind of wanted to research family history. But there's other people who are going there to drink, or to have a good time, or because their money goes farther, right? And so there's all kinds of just say, well, we shall say interesting kinds of personalities.
Right. Yeah. When I was reading the story Slow Train to Beijing, there was just so many very specific people in there that I felt like I had met, and that because the experience I had was so specific, I felt like I would never get to talk to anyone about it again. So it was amazing to see Alex, the kind of really cool Chinese American who's stylish. She's very hip, and then her fiance, who's like, this white Westerner who gets like the sense of power from being able to explain everything to all the other foreigners, and to say, I know about Chinese culture. It's such a particular experience that I thought was depicted so well here.
Thank you. Yeah, the self-appointed foreign expert, right? They're a group. So group.
Yeah. I also loved a moment. I'm gonna actually read like a section from that story that I really liked, if that's okay.
Please.
Actually, I'm sorry, this is from White Rabbit, the last section. You wrote, I'd come to Nanjing hoping to find some connection to my past, something that would perhaps console me, make up for the losses, for the sense of something missing in me, the hole that was always there in my life in America. But I was no fool. I knew that my grandfather was dead, and the China of his memories was gone too. And the Chinese who live now were rapidly throwing off the past and embracing a future of their own creation. Nothing in China was quite what I'd expected or hoped for. I really loved that idea, and how sober the narrator is, and understanding that she's kind of hoping for a different version of China than she actually encounters. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that too.
I feel like, yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to dramatize that, I found, for her
Mhm.
story, because I feel like it's a very internal emotion, but I felt like it was really important. And part of it is like when I first went as a child, like, well, as a teenager in 1985, and I saw my father's reaction, right? Like in some ways this was his homeland, but for 30 years, the US did not have relations. So, when they left and he was a teenager, they didn't think they would be leaving forever, right? Or for such a long period of time. They didn't know how long it would be, but it was 30 years before it was even legal to go back. US did not have
Mhm.
relations till 1979 again. And then for many, there's a long period of time. In the early days, my grandmother, was sending letters, sending care packages. She would send care packages with money, American money hidden in. She would like glue pages of books and magazines shut. She'd tuck the money on the inside. But so you flip through the book, there's a few pages would be stick together. You would know there's money in there, but her relatives would feel like there's no reason why she would send us a stupid old magazine, right? So they'd rip
Yeah.
everything apart very carefully. She would sew money into the hems
Wow.
of like pajamas, into long winter underwear. She would wash and rewash clothes that she would buy just to send to them, so it looked really ratty so no one would steal it. And then she would expect they would figure out she's not stupid, so they would pull it apart when they got it and find the money. And she did. She supported like just more than a dozen or maybe 2 dozen relatives that way for over a decade. And then when the Cultural Revolution hit, the packages were sent back, and people would open it up, and it was so offensive to my grandparents, because they would say China does not need old clothes, and then in this very bold calligraphy, and then send it back.
Oh,
um
wow.
and so it probably was sent back to Hong Kong, because you couldn't send anything directly where they lived in New York, and then it would be sent back then from Hong Kong to the United States. And so I had seen like my father's, like his memories, right, of China, and I saw them like kind of dashed before his eyes, because the people he remembered as being his aunts and uncles, his cousins, like they're all like, so much time had passed. So his, most of his aunts and uncles were dead. And the one
Mhm.
uncle who was still alive was walking with a cane and had been beaten during the Cultural Revolution. And it was just devastating to see that change. Someone he remembered, in the prime of his youth. And then he met, a cousin who had almost come with the family in 1949, but at the last minute they decided she would stay because of the girl. How you can take care of a girl? Maybe it'd be safer in China. Taking a girl overseas is, even to Taiwan, an island, in those days, thought overrun by soldiers. People were afraid of Chiang Kai-shek's soldiers. I mean, even the so-called, KMT side didn't like them, right? They were scary.
Mhm.
And so I saw like just the shock of him seeing the changes. And then we found his old house, his childhood home, it hadn't been demolished yet. And that's when he had his big freak out. And he started shouting in the streets. And he's like, everyone is poor. China is ruined. The communists have ruined
Wow.
China. Everyone is poor. And he's screaming. And I was like, oh my God, we're going to be arrested. But no, what was amazing is we had a Chinese guide, probably a party member who was supposed to take the like people, the Taiwan people who've gone to Taiwan, around to meet relatives. Everything is very bureaucratic. Um, and they were like, yes, everything is poor. I mean, everyone we would meet in those days was like, China is too poor. They're just furious because the world, China started to open up, right? They started to see people from other world, and Chinese people began to realize how far behind they'd fallen,
Mhm.
and they were
Mhm.
furious. So, I'd already kind of witnessed that experience of like going back, from my father witnessing what he had expected and it being completely different. And so then I
Mhm.
was thinking about it in this fictional character, because in some ways it's a stand-in for me, but not, because this person hasn't had that experience. So I felt like she would feel it full on, right?
Mhm.
Like she's gonna feel that shock of wanting to share in this culture, that because her grandfather has died and she loved him so much, and so she wants to feel closer to him, and China has moved on. It's not his China.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. It's so curious to hear you talking about your dad's reaction. Everyone really openly saying like China is so poor, because
uh-huh,
that is so different from now,
totally.
like
Yes,
how
yes.
people are allowed to talk about it. Like you would never, I think it would be quite taboo to openly admit inferiority, especially to like American countries, and to say like, oh, we're still poor, we're still behind, especially in the witness of a like Chinese government employee. And so that feels also interesting, like a way that the nation kind of rejects or refuses, whatever you're bringing there as an American citizen.
I think also the 80s, like people, like Chinese people today have a certain nostalgia for the 80s because of its
Mhm.
openness, right? If you hear about the
Yeah.
culture, like, it was just almost anything goes, because people are like
Mhm.
trying to absorb information so quickly. Um, but I think today, I mean, one wouldn't say that though, because China, like if you're in Nanjing, China does not look poor. Not if you've been to Nanjing, it is a
No. Yeah.
wealthy city with these beautiful mega malls, and like, oh, in San Francisco, we can only dream of the public transportation system, the gleaming subway, the really,
Mhm.
beautiful buses, and things run on time. And I mean, the infrastructure is so vastly improved from the 1980s, but also it feels in many ways so much more advanced than what we have in the US.
Right.
So I mean,
Yeah.
people wouldn't say, you wouldn't go to China and say, oh, everyone's so poor, because you don't see that,
Mhm.
generally, if you're just visiting, you'd have to
Right.
look for it.
Right, right. It's definitely not the version of China that is shown when you pop
Uh,
into the big cities and
yeah.
see. Yeah. I really also appreciated the title story, Tomorrow in Shanghai, because that to me felt like an example of really looking for the kinds of stories that aren't there for visitors, and kind of like the hardships that are often behind and contributed to the growth of these megacities.
I'm glad you said that about, you're such a smart reader. God, I feel so validated. I'm so happy talking to you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I needed this. I mean, that is kind of the whole point of writing that story, right? And including it, is that like we see this prosperity now, but it came at a price and somebody paid it. There are billionaires in China. There are a lot of people who are living enviably wealthy lives. And then there are people who really paid that price and had to do like really hard labor, and then paid a really like double price. Because like, for example, in that title story, it's about a blood seller, a blood merchant, actually not a blood seller, but he would go which was perfectly legal profession. In the 80s and 90s, there were people who were hired by city hospitals to go into the countryside and buy blood from rural farmers, because who else? It wasn't a donor culture in those days. How else are they going to get the blood? And so it was a nasty job. It was a lot of work. You go in those days, the roads, the highways were not yet built. So you'd go on these back bumpy roads. I've been on those back bumpy roads,
Yeah.
traveling in the 80s. And to just do that 12 hours a day, 7 days a week would be grueling on the body. And then no one who authorized this was thinking about, when you go to a village and you're collecting blood for a set period of time, how are you sterilizing that equipment when there isn't stable electricity, right? That what people weren't thinking that far ahead. And so what happened, as you probably know, is that these blood merchants ended up spreading HIV throughout rural provinces. And then when the central government found out about it, they were then deemed to be said to be doing illegal work, and they were scapegoated and they were blamed, and the many were executed. And so it was a terrible policy. It wasn't well thought out, but the person who came up with that, we don't know what happened to them, right? Who authorized this at a higher level, but we know that the grunt, at the ground level, definitely paid.
Yeah. Something I really appreciate about this story is how it didn't place blame on the character who was actually, trading in the blood or being the blood merchant, but really is implicating him within the greater system that, rewarded all of this and for a time was profiting off of this until it became, disastrous and inconvenient for the system. Yeah. I just loved the repetition of no one asked, these people in his life as to whether or not he was a bad person, because it really kind of points out like this is a person that's lost in the middle of this tale of systems, really.
It's kind of one of the themes of the whole book. Is just who gets lost in these systems, and like the brutality of the competition that we're all placed in. It's, global capitalism is brutal, and as societies open up and globalize, there are some winners, and there's also just the brutality just spreads. And I felt like when I was working on this collection, I started after the election of Donald Trump, right? And so that was a really bleak moment to begin with. And I feel like we're still in that bleakness. And I feel like we're still in that process of scapegoating. Like he just made it very overt and coming from the highest office in land and on our land. And it was then repeated through our media, which is amplified globally. And I feel like, the scapegoating that Donald Trump did without, it just sounds like a joke, without reflection, right? About these systems that are causing people to lose jobs, that are causing poverty, which are causing people to feel like they're losing out, which then are looking for a scapegoat. Right. I think that's why we get to this violence of the present. We've had so much, for example, anti-Asian violence, right? There's so many kinds of violence, but certainly I've been having to live with that. And so that's, it's kind of what I was thinking about, is putting this collection together. It's like, how do I address that? And I just couldn't address it in the moment because it's too bleak. I could in essays, I wrote some op-eds, but like for stories, I don't know if you find this, I'm going to ask you about fiction writing. I feel like when I'm writing fiction, it's on a real, like an event, even though it's not what happened, feels more real than like when I write an essay and I'm actually talking about real events. Do you find that when you were writing your novel?
It feels sometimes like I think in a lot of ways, my characters maybe will end up like kind of commenting sideways on things that are happening in real life, because it's just something that I'm thinking about as I'm drafting. Like something that Etienne kind of comments on in my book is like about knowledge passed on and how that's passed on through books and how important books are. And then that somehow ended up being related to thoughts I was having about book bans in the US. And I'm not like a very good essayist, and it seems easier to write about these things in fiction because the characters are able to kind of be ambiguous about it and grapple with things in the way that I personally grapple with things.
Do you feel like when you're writing fiction, like, I mean, you have the family stories. Your father comes from Anhui, and I'm
Mhm.
assuming he must have told you stories of growing up in, you know, these villages and etc. But do you feel like when you're actually writing it, it just takes it to another level, and it's like living in your head in a very odd way? Like these characters can feel like more real than like what I'm doing in my daily life.
I do, I do. For me, it was really important. When I was writing this book, I just moved back to the US from China, and I was like just missing being in China so much. Like I felt in many ways so at home there, even despite the ways that I felt totally kind of like an other, the way that Alex and Lulu feel. And so when I was back in the US, I just wanted to like relive back in China. And so like writing the book felt kind of like a way of doing that. And so it was comforting in that sense to make it feel as close to reality as I could. Yeah. I wanted to ask you also about a feeling that you gave your characters that I heard you talk about in an interview. You had said that, you know, this title, Tomorrow in Shanghai, is about hope, and that, you know, the title character, the young doctor, so not the title character, the young doctor in that story, at the end he says, you know, he definitely feel better tomorrow in Shanghai. And I feel like also the title of the story, Life on Mars, in a way is like is kind of hopeful as well, like this go has like a really kind of hopeful vision of what life on Mars might be. And I was wondering how you as a writer see that hope. Is that like a true hope that they have, or do you view it as a false hope? What kind of hope do you think that is?
Oh, I think it's a true hope. It's just I want it to be a true hope. Otherwise, how do we get through life, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Uh-huh.
I had to hold on to it because I really, I mean, I started putting together, like I started writing most of these stories after Trump was elected.
Yeah.
Um, I was putting this collection together. It took a couple of years or so, right? And so these are kind of bleak times we're living in. I mean, there are
Mhm.
other bleaker times, perhaps, you know, in the history, but they're not particularly optimistic times. At least not to me. I can feel very depressed sometimes, and so I had to think of ways to get through that depression and think of ways to even give my characters hope. So even though maybe it's a kind of hope through it, like from a slant, right? You know, and the reader might think, wow, that's hopeless. This kid's screwed, you know.
Mhm.
But like, how else do we get through life? And I think of like Tomorrow in Shanghai, like for many Chinese, certainly of like my father's generation and my grandparents' generation, even though they're not from Shanghai, although my father was born in Shanghai. Shanghai represent like the future of China, right? Because it's the most cosmopolitan city. Back in the Republican era,
Mhm.
it was the most developed. It was the most modern. It had the skyscrapers and the movie theaters and the movies and all of that. It represented the world, and it was part of China. So I thought of Shanghai as being that future, that hopeful, beautiful future that at least a certain segment of the population aspires to. And so it kind of
Mhm.
became the metaphor for home and for this safer, happier, but cosmopolitan. Like I don't want this to be like a reactionary novel where we're gonna like the false hope of thinking we can go backwards to this fake happy time when things were better, you know.
Mhm. Mhm. And how do you, like as a fiction writer, relate to fiction and hope? Is it something that you find gives you hope? Are you that kind of writer? Do you feel like it gives you a place to escape? I know that you wrote this during hopeless, feeling political times.
Um, it must, right? Like why else would I do it? I feel like it
Mhm.
must. I have to have hope when I'm writing, and I think that fiction has felt like it's almost like a dissociative space. Like I can just really let most of my daily problems drop away. I have to, otherwise I can't write fiction. And it sounds like I don't know how that if that was that way for you also in writing, even though you're writing about cultural evolution and a story of conflict within a family, and many things are quite sad. Like I didn't think of it as a sad book. And I felt like I could feel that love for China in it, even though it's at this period of time in Chinese history that many people think of as just relentlessly bleak. But it was at that turning point where I feel like there was a lot of hope.
Yeah, yeah, I really wanted to depict that. And unfortunately, I do think it's a point where a lot of the hopes that people maybe had haven't been realized totally in the way that history ended up playing out. But I think it was amazing to think of a time when you're living in history and you have the feeling that things are about to change. I was really young when Barack Obama was elected, but I do remember that feeling in the country that things were different. And that feels in such stark contrast to like the general feeling in America now, right? And I think that's really special to live through times like that. And I wanted to depict something like it.
That is a great analogy. I hadn't really, I mean, yeah, I mean, I could see where that would come from. Like, right, 2008 did feel like a changing point, like a tipping point, just as like,
Mhm.
the end of the Cultural Revolution when they reopened the universities. I also think it's just culturally so Chinese, right? Like hope in China was like, oh, now they've reinstated the exam.
Right.
We can take an exam to go to college. And
Yes, yeah, yeah. And can you imagine in the US, like it would not be viewed as
that would not
a
be viewed as
big
the
event.
hopeful
Yeah.
thing. But I felt like that's why I also felt was interesting about this novel. Is like I haven't read another novel. Like I've read a lot of Cultural Revolution novels, and I've read a lot of like takes place in college novels. I felt like this was just so culturally specific and to that moment. And also, yeah, it's like that feeling of hope because now you could take that exam and you could possibly get to college. And I think you
Yeah.
depicted that so well. The
Thank
young people, what the lengths that they would go to study and just to find the study materials. And it doesn't come across as grueling so much as hopeful, right? It was a time when you
right.
could dream.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know about you, but in my family, like growing up, all the like triumphant stories were about people being really good at tests, basically. Like it'd be like, yeah, and your great grandfather, he was so smart. He almost passed the imperial exam. And my dad's story is very much about being great at test taking. And that it just seems like it's a very culturally specific way of telling a family story.
I mean, I don't because my family is these relatives are older. It was like they had different types of exams. So I feel like it was like, but it was definitely focused on like opportunities for education. Like when my grandmother's mother had bound feet, right? Girls weren't allowed to be educated by and large.
Mhm.
So there's her triumphant story was that missionaries happened by the family compound, heard her screaming, and convinced her parents to unbind her feet, and she was allowed to be educated by them. Because otherwise, she would have no hope of finding a husband because she had these horrible big feet, right? And what Chinese man would want her? You have to be the certain kind of educated. And then my grandmother, like her happy story was that her mother allowed her to be educated the same as a boy, the same as her brother. So she and her brothers went to school, and that was her triumph. There wasn't really like an exam, although she actually did. Her big triumph was that she took the entrance exam for the first time that it was open to women in 1920, and she passed. She
Wow.
was one of 8 women to pass. Um, and she always was somewhat humble about it because she would say it's because her mother allowed her to be educated the same as her brothers.
Wow.
So
Yeah, yeah, it's so interesting also. I think a lot of like there's stereotypes about Chinese people in the US, like, oh, they're, test takers, whatever, whatever. And it's so interesting because it's not just about being Chinese in the US. Like this is about, being Chinese in China. It's so much a part of the culture, this emphasis on education.
yeah, because that was the hope, right?
Mhm,
I
mhm.
mean, it could be a false hope. I mean, because it doesn't always lead to what people think, like a better
Right.
life, or it
Mhm,
doesn't nowadays. It doesn't necessarily lead to even a higher standard of living for many people. It's
mhm.
connections, right? It's connections. It can be business, things like that. But I think culturally, people invested hope in that idea.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I'm curious also about, so you mentioned like you first went to China in the mid 1980s with your dad, and I imagine a lot of the relatives that you all met during that visit are no longer alive. I'm curious as to like how your relationship has changed over the years with China and with writing about China now that the people that kind of like anchored those stories are gone.
it was funny that you say that. I had 'cause I feel like now, like, oh my gosh, I have my own memories that anchor me to
Mhm,
China, right? And I was like, I was thinking about that. It's like I've seen a whole lot of things now in China.
mhm,
Like I'm thinking, reflecting about the differences that I've seen from the 80s until, the present. And so I feel like with this collection, I kind of leaned into that because I've suddenly realized that that is knowledge and that is something that's maybe worth writing about. Um, and that I could center some of those stories. So like the studying abroad stories and the different kinds of communities that I have moved in and out of. Um, and I thought that was like that's a kind of sea change kind of perspective that I had. And I think it was triggered because I went to Nanjing in 2018. I feel very fortunate. Like I was going to go back the next year of that winter, and then of course the pandemic hit. So
mhm,
um, but as I was really fortunate to be able to see things like right before everything just went to hell. And also it was
mhm,
also a really happy period of time before US-China relations kind of took like this real sour turn. So
mhm,
when I was there, it was amazing just to see, just reflect. I was thinking about the changes that I have witnessed in my own life, just in this one city.
mhm.
And like some of the losses, and I wrote an essay about this for Catapult, which is about the room, like the villages that just were outside the city wall of Nanjing are gone. So like when
Mm,
you say your parents or your father's old village has now been incorporated into the city of Hefei, right?
mhm,
Um, I could see that like outside of Nanjing, those villages are gone. And I remember when I was teaching there, no, I had kids riding in on their bikes, from these villages to go to school in the city. It's skyscrapers and highways. And there used to be, all these fields, and there were even haystacks. I went on a art history field trip with with classmates from Nanda, and there were these Qilin Ming Dynasty just statues that have just been there in the field for hundreds of years, and the farmers would just, plant around them. And they would decorate them for the festivals, but they just, lived around this really ancient, amazing imperial history, and they're gone now, right? Because they had to
yeah.
be moved for the highways. And I found just one of them. Like I was in the city museum, and there was a poster on the wall of the Chilean where they used to be in the fields. And I was like, oh my God, because that's like what I remember. And
Yeah.
there's just one statue now in a glass case in the museum. And it was like it kind of gutted me, actually. Um, like I felt the loss in that moment. And I just had to let it go and realize like, okay, like it's people, one would hope, needed this development and modernization. You can't just keep these fields where they were with their beautiful, exquisite, amazing Ming Dynasty Chilean
Yeah.
statues, right? I think I just have to reconcile, like, okay, that part of history is gone. And I talked to a professor, teaches at one of the universities in Nanjing, and she was saying she remembers that 'cause she was also a student at Nanda in the 80s. And she remembered those Chilean. She says, yes, the living history is gone. That living history is gone.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and that's something that I struggle with too, because I haven't had as long of a history in China as you, but I hear like about the villages, how they used to be from my dad, and I have this kind of like secondhand nostalgic feeling
Uh-huh.
towards it. And I have to remind myself, like, it is probably for the best that people are not having to live in the villages anymore, and that life has developed beyond that. But it is really hard not to feel a sense of loss for that kind of life as well.
And I think, and I know, and it's not, I mean, it's not just us. I think that there are also like Chinese people in the villages and in these areas who also
Mhm,
feel that sense of
mhm.
loss mixed with a sense of sometimes hope, like, okay, well, everyone hopes it's for the better, right?
Yeah,
The kind
yeah.
of the development. And there are certainly some advantages, but I know that there's also a sense of absolute recognition that, you're losing culture. Um, when these just amazing historical sites have to be taken down or
Mhm,
paved
mhm.
over or built over. And I think that's also one of the freaky things about being American. Is like we don't have that same kind of history, right?
Yeah,
Our
yeah.
land has been here, and and it, but I don't. you know, but I'm not indigenous, so I don't have the same type of ties to the landscape. Um, but you can't just drive across America and see, you know, these monuments or these Buddhist temples or these statues that date from, you know, 1,000 years ago.
Mhm,
It
mhm.
wasn't, it's not that type of, yeah, we're a young country. It's also a colonizing country.
Mhm.
And much of that older history has been erased long, long ago.
Yeah, yeah. And it's also just so interesting what you said about like a sea change and realizing like you have your own stories in China. And it's, you know, I'm guessing as you were a child, like you experienced China through the lens of your parents' or your dad's stories. And suddenly, you know, that changes so much.
Yeah. I know you are already creating those stories, right, with your novels, and you're gonna in your own lens and things you've witnessed, which I feel like is really important to do. I feel like, you know, it's really important. Things change so rapidly, right? Like what you saw in 2018 is already different today.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And so I feel like, you know, as I tell my students, write down, don't think that it's not important. Write down your feelings, write down what you feel today, write down your history of this moment, because things change so quickly, so quickly.
Mhm, mhm. I wonder if we should see if anyone else has questions that they want to ask. I have some more I can ask, but I mean, we can check in with the audience and see.
I actually have one question just while we wait for audience questions to come in, but please, anyone in the audience, type a question in the chat box if you have one, and I will read it off. It's a question for Mei Li, but also for both of you. Um, in an interview before, Mei Li, you said that you thought that all writing was political in some way. And I think you said that you couldn't think of one piece of writing that wasn't political. So I'm just wondering if since then you still feel that way. And a question for both of you, do you feel like writers have a political and moral obligation to their readers?
By political, I don't necessarily mean that like following the politics of the state,
Mhm.
right? I don't feel like every writing is here to prop up the politics of the state or of a particular party or overtly that way. But if you think about it being from, you know, even writing about um, a personal memory or a family story, because we live within these larger organizations and institutions and structures, it has a political function. So if you're a minoritized person and you're writing your own personal family story, you're resisting your own erasure, and that has a political that that functions politically, right, in vis-a-vis the power of the state. So that's what I mean by all writing is political. I feel like some people, they may not overtly think I'm going to write this have political meaning. But I think that, you know, if we step back and analyze it, we can think of writing in how it functions politically.
Yeah, yeah, I would really agree with that. And I would add to it that I feel really lucky to be writing at a time when I'm writing because, you know, I hear people who are Chinese American writers or Asian writers from a generation above me where I hear like they really had to fight to be able to tell stories with Chinese American narrators. Like I hear stories of like um, my one of my mentors, Samantha Chang, like submitting workshop stories with Chinese American narrators and people just reading them as like ethnographies rather than as fiction and workshop. And I feel like because of that really political work that people like writers in a generation above me have done, I grew up not really questioning so much, like, can I write stories about this? And that felt like a given to me. So I think writing can also like do that political work of seeing storytelling and allowing us to see you know, what kind of stories have legitimacy to be told and which deserve space as much as writers from the majority deserve space.
Great. Well, if no one else has any other questions, I know Belinda, you said you had another question if you'd like to past that now?
Yeah, this is a little bit different from what we've talked about so far, but I saw also that you've studied Chinese literature. You got an MA in this field, and you had translated Bajin's work, his autobiography. His book Family was really important to me, actually, and it was kind of like another such an interesting collision of our interests. I was wondering if you could speak about if your works, how your work studying Chinese literature or doing translation has influenced your fiction writing.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I felt like that was the thing that saved my fiction writing, because I'm of that earlier generation where there was a lot of silencing and like it was like it's really hard to write from your own personal experience and lens. So that's why I felt so liberated, like, I can do this. I can
Mhm.
center my own experiences of China in time. And that's worthy to do because I do feel like there was just a few basic stereotypes that were always being compared to
Mhm.
critically and by publishers. And like, even if you're aesthetically or if group of writers who aren't doing that, there is these larger institutional structures within publishing houses, within reviewing structures that really shoot down anything that doesn't follow that stereotype. People are very fond of certain stereotypes. And so I can remember just, like, the good earth. Bless her heart, bless her
That in
heart.
Anhui, by the way, yeah.
Oh, bless her heart, Pearl Buck. Bless her
Yeah.
heart. Yeah. And I mean, she had really good intentions, and in the 1930s, I'm sure it was really critically important and valuable for like the majority white American readership to have these stories, to kind of give them, like, they don't know, it's very hard to travel. There's not, TV, there's no way to know, right? And it helped to create empathy for China during World War II and during the Sino-Japanese War. But oh my God, growing up as a kid in America with, Olan over your head, and like, this is what a Chinese woman is, and it's like the peach. It's like, oh my God, and she's so subservient and she's passive, and she's like, it's not less so in the book, I will grant Pearl Buck that, than in the movie, which is just so atrocious because even played by a white woman, right? It's just such a flattening characterization. And this idea of Asian women in general and Chinese women in particular as being, victims, eternal victims and passive victims and very weak, comes from kind of this much earlier generation. It comes from war. It comes from political positioning. It comes from, if you look at the propaganda of the era, and even from the 19th century, why is what Edward Said said in Orientalism, why are wars, how do you convince people to wage a war? It's like to say you've got to save brown women from brown men, right? Because if you say we're just going to plunder this country so that the wealthy of this country can get wealthier, who would sacrifice their sons for that? So I feel like I've completely forgotten what you asked me, but I feel like growing up with that earlier generation stereotypes um, was very painful, and I'm so glad it feels like we're at a tipping point. I feel like your stories now are possible, and like I can write into that space, and it's just it's a better place to be in the literary
Mhm.
landscape.
Yeah. 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 I feel incredibly lucky.
I don't mean that, and I don't mean to like be like, oh, you're so lucky. I just mean that I
No.
feel lucky to read your novel.
Oh,
I
thank
feel
you.
lucky to read A Map for the Missing. Again, I feel like the characters and the mother, like, these characters have a lot of agency, even though it centers on the brothers and men and their rivalries. Each one of the women characters, from the ex-girlfriend, the wife at home, even though they are kind of satellites to the main story, they are individuals. They have their individual personalities, and I feel like they have their individual lives that can go on beyond the page, and they certainly do not fit into that stereotype. And so that was another one of the reasons why it was a pleasure to read.
Thank you. That's very
And
kind.
also
And
the classmate, I loved his classmate. Is it Hanwen? Was it
yeah, yeah,
from the
yeah,
Cultural Revolution days? She's the really
yeah,
smart one, right?
yeah,
She's
she
really
is. She
smart.
is.
She's the go-getter. Like, if not for her, he would
Yeah,
also not have made it. And I felt like that is
yeah.
like such a great character.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
And I realize I'm going into the darkness. The light is changing here, and I'm not near like a light plug, so I'm getting darker and darker. You can see the passage of time.
Well, that's the perfect time to wrap up. But thank you both so much for speaking today. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm sure everyone who was with us enjoyed it as well. I also really enjoyed Tomorrow in Shanghai and A Map for the Missing, and I highly recommend both of those. You can purchase them in our shop, but you can also purchase them on bookshop.org. Really just get it from any bookstore because they're both so great, and I really recommend them.